this is an important part with digital currencies that I think I haven't fully explained before. We talk about governments basically using digital currencies as a way to monitor every transaction, as a way to police you on levels they could not police you otherwise. But digital currencies mean more than that. If it's centralized banks controlling it, particularly in countries where the centralized banks are not government run, this is not technically governance by elected officials at that point. This is governance by unelected officials within the financial sector. The banks, then, in some regards, become the government. Let me show you this. It says the Federal Reserve is sowing the seeds for its central bank digital currency, again, CBDC. It may seem that the purpose of a CBDC is to facilitate transactions and enhance economic activity, but CBDCs are mainly about more government control over individuals. If a CBDC were implemented, the central bank would have access to all transactions in addition to being capable of freezing accounts. It may seem dystopian, something that only totalitarian governments would do, but there have been recent cases of asset freezing in Canada and Brazil. Moreover, a CBDC would give the government the power to determine how much a person can spend, establish expiration dates for deposits, and even penalize people who saved money, because they want circulation of cash within the economy. They don't necessarily want you having money in the bank and having it, stored up for when you need it. Further in, they state, again, when you're talking about, I think, there are forms of, I think, centralized and totalitarian, crony capitalism. It's not a true free market. This is more like a tyranny of the banking infrastructure, when essentially the infrastructure itself has created a cartel, and that cartel can essentially use capital as a means of totalitarianism as well. You're watching, in reality, technically what you would call syndicalism, a merging, I think, of technocracy and syndicalism. Syndicalism being essentially the tyranny of unions, a type of socialism proposed where, remember, if you get to the nuts and bolts of communism, they talk about the idea of seizing the means of production, the workers' revolution. That does not necessarily have to be workers' revolution in terms of taking over the governments. That can also be a workers' revolution to seize the means of production through other means. I would say ESG, environmental social governance, represents a type of that. And you're watching now essentially the banking system, the union system, which are no longer true unions because they're so deeply regulated, where even their ability to have general strikes is restricted by government. They're so deeply governed, in other words, that they're basically just government branches at this point. Of course, so banks, businesses, unions, and nonprofit entities like the ACLU and so on, which have created a cartel, and that cartel is setting policies on money and businesses, and using that cartel, they've essentially found a way to put the entire economy or the entire capitalist structure, the means of production. They found a way to seize those means. Right? Seize the means of production, communism. They found a way to seize that and use it for socialist agendas. It is a cartel, a totalitarian cartel. And the CBDCs, the centralized banking digital currencies, will give that cartel the ability of monitoring you, meaning they can keep you in line. They can enforce the ESG standards, environmental social governance standards, on businesses. They can enforce it to some degree on investors. The next step is enforcing it on you. And remember, they're already talking about, for example, having your carbon footprint tax, monitoring you and how in line you are with the green agenda. They've already talked about redesigning programs that will fine you money, charge you money if you spread quote-unquote misinformation. In other words, and even as well regulating speech to an extent where they will look at you if you're spreading what they deem as racism. And that's such a broad term these days, it can mean anything. They regard capitalism, traditional capitalism, as racist now. Just emphasizing how broad they've interpreted that. Biden came out, in fact, yesterday. They passed the Marriage Act that forces churches to hold gay weddings and stuff. Biden came out, and he's saying that if you oppose this, Biden came out and he merged the idea of anti-Semitism, not liking Jews. He merged that idea with somehow the trans movement and the homosexual movement. And so if you're against the idea of castrating children, you don't think children should be castrated without the knowledge of their parents and so on, that if you oppose that, then you're also an anti-Semite and everything else under the sun, essentially. They're merging their narratives. And as they're merging their narratives, they're creating the systems through which they can enforce it on you. The centralized bank digital currencies represent that level of it. The Mises Institute says this. They say in 2017, the international. This is the rolling out of it, folks. Let me explain to you. This is important, right? This explains to you the hour of the day, so to speak, the time we are in. The hour has grown late. It says here in 2017, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, published a document offering suggestions to governments, even in the face of strong public opposition, on how to move toward a cashless society. And the U.S. is getting ready to establish its own CBDC or something similar. The first step was taken in August when the Federal Reserve announced FedNow, FedNow. FedNow. FedNow will be an instant payment system and is scheduled to launch between May and July of 2023. FedNow is practically identical to Brazil's PIX. PIX was implemented by the Central Bank of Brazil, the BCB, in November of 2020. It is a convenient instant payment system using mobile devices without user fees, and with a reputation of being safe to use. A year after its launch, PIX already had 112 million people registered, or just over half the Brazilian population. Of course, frauds and scams do occur over PIX, but most are social engineering scams and are not system flaws. That is, they are scams that exploit the public's lack of knowledge of PIX technology. Bear in mind that PIX is not the Brazilian CBDC. It's different than centralized bank digital currency. It is just a payment system. However, the BCB, the Brazilian Central Bank, has access to transitions made through PIX. Therefore, PIX or PIX can be considered a seed, the seed for the Brazilian CBDC. Back, just kind of laying that out. Essentially, in other words, Brazil has begun the first step in rolling out a CBDC, the PIX system, a digital payment system working through smartphones. And they're noting that FedNow, the one for the United States, is basically modeled on the same idea. This is a precursor to the complete CBDC. This is step one, in other words. They say it is already an invasion of the privacy of Brazilians, and FedNow is set to follow suit. FedNow is the one we're going to get in the United States. Additionally, the New York Federal Reserve, has recently launched a 12-week pilot program. This is happening as we speak right now, in fact, with several commercial banks to test the feasibility of a CBDC in the U.S. The program will use digital tokens to represent bank deposits. Institutions involved in the program will make simulated transactions to test the system. According to Reuters, quote, the pilot program will test how banks using digital dollar tokens in a common database can help speed up payments. They note banks involved in the pilot program include BNY Mellon, Citi, HSBC, MasterCard, PNC Bank, TD Bank, Truist, US Bank, and Wells Fargo. These are going to be your new government officials, folks. Those banks, if this thing rolls out fully, those are going to be your new government officials in some regards. Remember, as we talked about yesterday, that the idea of the Great Reset is multi-stakeholder capitalism. It's not going to be, in other words, government as we know it will change. Your elected officials will no longer be the sole holders of power of governance. It is going to be a multi-stakeholder form of governance, where you have the circle of your normal government and the three branches of government on one side. You're going to have businesses on the other side, investors controlling business and steering that whole ship, alongside different types of organizations such as the ACLU, nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, environmental groups, and so on. I mentioned yesterday with the whole rolling out of the smart cities, they have like 100,000 partners. That establishment, in other words, the establishment of unelected officials, of woke capital, of banks, of businesses, big tech, your Zuckerbergs and your Googles and Facebooks of the world, they are going to have, to an extent, government power through other means. And the multi-stakeholder capitalist model, multi-stakeholder capitalism, is going to be tyranny through the manipulation of capitalism. Not true capitalism as in communism versus capitalism, but instead cronyism, which represents a type of merging of the capitalist system with the socialist system, a technocratic financial tyranny. That is what they're trying to create.